All right, so if you remember from last week, we left off my prefab 2. So what I was covering here was the fact that we can have prefabs of multiple game objects now, or a more complicated prefab. And a prefab is just a game object saved to the file drive. So here's an instantiated prefab, a game object in our memory. And really the permanent version is here down in our file system. And the way I had it set up is the root object just has a transform and a name. And then you have as many children game objects as you want. They are on a layer painted object because they have a collider. And we can click on them and see if we should delete them with right click. And they have a mesh filter, which just is a listing of its geometry. And the renderer, which has our new material connected to it. And its own transform to position object. So here's a cube and here's a sphere. Now, this is our create loop here, and here's where actually picking which primitive we should create and messing with the scale. And I was covering this area here, like the render. So if there's a render sitting at the top, which the simpler primitive did, we some similar prefab had, we just messed with the color at the root. But then we went through and looked through the children. In this case, we have a sphere and a cube children. And for each one, if there's a render, then we'd mess with the color and emission on that. So in this more complicated prefab, this is actually doesn't get run. It's false. And we loop through two objects at the children. But now I can move in down into here and start talking about the animator. Okay, so this was the prefab as I left it off last week. We have some parts of different game objects, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the animation folder where I already have a bunch of animators and animators and animations. But I'm going to go ahead and create a new animator controller. So here we have animators and animations. So first, we're just going to start off with a controller, and I'm going to call it the same as my prefab. So my prefab 02. And you can notice this icon looks like this, and when I click on it, it's a controller file. All right, so I'm going to go back up to my prefab, and I'm going to assign it. Or my instance of a prefab, I should say. And now we have an animator controller at the root in addition to the transform. And we're going to use this to create and run animations on the entire prefab. It can animate on any of the game objects within it. But the first step is create an animator controller component that sits at the root. And then we're going to go and open up our animator window, and we're going to go and open up our animation window, and I'm just going to pin them here. And this is the animator, and it's a state machine. And a state machine is it's a concept in computer science, and we use it for handling different types of animations, and it's also very useful in artificial intelligence for game engines. But in our situation, you can think of a state machine as a way to manage the fact that we're going to have multiple different animations that could be played, and we have to figure out which state should we be in. So right now we have kind of these three of these nodes, any state, our entry point, and our exit point. And they're not pointing to anything right now, so it's like an empty controller. So the next step is I'm going to jump over to the animation window, and you have to click on what you want to animate. So my prefab 02. Notice there's an animator, and notice it says to begin animating, just create an animation clip. Now notice if I click on other game objects, it says, oh, you have to create an animator and an animation. Right, so there's no, it's actually contextual. It's based on what you have selected. So we're going to select our instance of our my prefab 02 here, and we're going to create an animation clip. ultimately going to create three different animations that we can cycle between. So it goes into my animation folder, because that's where it was last, but you can navigate to where you want to go. And so I'm going to call it first the name of the prefab, so that the animation files kind of sit nicely with the animator file. And then I'm just going to call it like Anim01, because I got 01, 02, 03. I got three I have to make. So now we have an animation open. So this is our animation clip. And this is the animation window, and this is a timeline. And by default, we start at time 0, and the animation ends at 1 second. So you can make animations as short as long as you want, and I'm scrolling out to say like we're out at 9 seconds. I'm going to zoom back in, and we're just going to do really basic animations that last 1 second long. And notice as I zoom in, and I'm moving left and right, we have 60 frames in a second. So you might be thinking these are like 60 seconds in a minute. But there's actually 60 frames in a second. So in this animation system, we're breaking up a second into 60 parts, much like we break a minute up into 60 parts. So we have 60 frames per second. And we talked about frame rate before. And usually a human eye gets tricked into seeing motion at like 12 to 15 frames per second. TV is usually running at around 30 frames per second. Just know that this animation system runs at 60 frames per second. So here, at 30 frames, 0 seconds, 30 frames, we're halfway through the second. And notice I can scrub through the time, and the number changes here. This is showing you how many frames we are. So you go past 60, and this shows how many, what frame we're currently on in our timeline. And animations are usually just changes to component properties, just changes of the values, changes of the properties over time. And so when we start animating, we can click on Add Property. And notice here that we have access to the transform component at the root, and then we have access to the children game objects. So we can go all the way through the hierarchy of at the prefab level. So that's why I put the animator at the root of the prefab, because then we could just go down and animate anything underneath it. Just note that whatever properties you change with animation, you cannot change with code. And so it's like either you're going to have to dynamically change something with your code, or you have the option to change it with the animation system. So, for example, the roots of my prefab, I'm updating the position, the rotation, and the scale when I place an object. Like here, I'm updating the scale. Here, when I create it, I set the position and the rotation, right? So that's the root of the prefab. So I'm not going to animate, I'm not going to change that. I am going to mess around with the children's transforms because they're free to use. They're not being manipulated by anything. So we can create three animations. And I'm just going to focus on the transform. I'm going to have one animation be about position, one about rotation, and one about scale. So I'm going to click Add Property. I'm going to go into the cube. And notice that there's different components I can dive into. You should recognize these all. But I'm going to dive into the transform. And I'm going to add the position property. And now notice it's listed here. And we have a little diamond at the beginning and at the end. So these are keyframes. A keyframe is like saying, hey, at this point in time, these properties, these values will be a certain number. So at time 0, X, Y, and Z of position will be these numbers, and at time 1, or 1 second, at the end of the animation, they will be these values, which happen to be the same. So that's why I like clicking Add Property. because you get a keyframe at the beginning and at the end, which means we can just do a little looping animation. So if you just go to the center of the animation, or the center of the timeline, half a second in, 30 frames in, we can click Add Keyframe, and notice now there's some diamonds here, and they're highlighted, they're blue. I can click off them, and I could select them. But whenever you edit these values, there's going to be wherever you're standing, wherever your tick is on the timeline. So I'm just going to move it to 30. And I'm just going to change them. I'm just going to say maybe 2 units and, I don't know, 2 units. So I changed X and Y, right? So now as I'm scrubbing through the timeline, you can see as I'm moving different frames, you can see our values are changing. Oh, sorry, I had to click off it to get the X to update. So here's our original X and Y, our new X and Y. Here's movement between the two, and then we're going back to the original values. So we're just creating some really basic looping animations. And just know that our start and end, those keyframes were the original values. And I just did a new one in the middle of the timeline, and I can click play, and it looks like this. And I just decided to change the X and Y values just because it's easy to see it. Z is going toward the camera in a way, but it's up to you. You can do whatever you want. All right, so this is my position animation so far on the cube. And note that these are called keyframes. And these are like property values that I designate. I'm designating the time and the value. So at these certain times, the values will be certain numbers. And then the computer does the in-betweens. The computer is figuring out the change in value, the interpolation from X and Y and Z here to X and Y and Z here, and figures out how these numbers should change at each frame. And so in reality, it's just the computer's just saying new frame, update, new frame, update, new frame, update, right? And it's just these kind of popping moves. But these are such small little fractions of a second that we can't even notice the move. So it doesn't look poppy to us. It looks like fluid motion. And the computer does all the math to figure out how to change all these values between your keyframes. And as long as the start and the beginning are the same, we've got a looping situation. It looks fluid. Now, let me show you another way. So let's say I want to start animating on the sphere. And I'm going to go down to its transform, and I'm going to add position. So now, and I'm going to open that up. And we have keyframes on the beginning and the end, and I'll move to the middle, somewhere in the middle. You know, you don't have to be precisely in, but it's just to get a nice looping animation. Now, I can show you that we can use these controls for maybe a little bit more easier way to do an animation. So instead of having to like add a key and type in the numbers, you can move to the time you want, select the object that you want, you know, add the property here, everything's set up, and then just click record, and now just move it and whatever you want it to do. So let's just say I just want to move it down to the left a little bit, and notice that a keyframe was placed. And I'm going to unclick record. That's really important because if you leave that on, everything you're doing, like you could keep changing values and not even be realizing it. So now I'm going to go back into game view and click play. And now we have two elements moving and doing different things. And we have 1 second loopable animation because the keyframes at the beginning and the end are the same. And you can see how the values, the numbers are changing between these keyframes over time. And so this is called the dope sheet. I forgot to say that. We have the dope sheet and curves. And the dope sheet looks like this. It looks like this like grid, this timeline, and it's full of keyframes that you add. And you can select keyframes, you can delete them, you can copy and paste them, you can move them around. You can even grab like 2 different sets and scale them. And you know, it's very interactive how to build your animations. And so this is our first animation, and we're animating on position. And just some more terminology is that all this animation terminology is coming from the animation industry. That was kind of like really everyone who set the terminology was like Disney because they were a big player. And these are called keyframes. And actually, like the master animator would draw out these main poses, these main situations, the main keyframes of an animation, and then the junior animators would do the in-between animation. So we call them keyframes, and the animation between them we call them in-betweens. So it's like the computer is like your junior animator. He's figuring out all the math to change from one number to another. You're just specifying the main poses. So start and beginning, start and end have the same pose. And we just go to the middle and we just set a different pose, and we let the computer just figure out how to change all the values from frame to frame. So these are keyframes, in-betweens. This is the dope sheet showing like a graph style of timeline. And animation is really just changing values or changing properties of components over time, and transform is a big one. Now this is the curve view, this is the curve editor. And we have 6 lines right now because there's 3 floats for this position and 3 for these, and you can just like select certain ones, like this is just the cube, this is just the sphere, and there's an XYZ for each. Now you can zoom out and you can see like the animation gets repeated over and over again, and that's because we're setting on a looping situation. It's just playing that 1 second over and over again, and because the start and end are the same, we get a nice flow. And with the curves, you can select kind of these keyframes too. They're kind of called more like Bezier curve handles or curve handles, but you can change how the curve is interpolated. So by default, it's like a nice graceful, let me just move it down a little bit, and you can kind of see the curve some more. So I just changed the value of Y, but I did it in the curve editor. And so sometimes some people like to work in the curve editor or the dope sheet, but you could see the Y curve, the change in the Y value. And you see this interpolation is like a nice smooth curve. Now you can change it. So if you don't want it, you can do some more crazy or more drastic changes. You can also make these linear and like have a more straight change in value. But these like sloping curves work really well. They give a feeling of momentum and weight, and they make it feel more, snappy, and there's a little bit more of emotion than like a mechanical linear curve. So that's the curve editor. You don't really need to mess with it, but these are still the keyframes. It's just they're like curve handles in this view. So now that we created one animation and we're really happy with it, we can create another animation. It would just create my clip is what it said. So my prefab02, anim02. We're in the same folder. Click create. Now it's an empty animation. Nothing is happening. And this time we're going to work on, go down to the cube. We're going to get the rotation. And I'll just get the rotation of this sphere too, and open them up and go to the middle, and I'll select one, say the cube. I can go into scene view. I'll press the E key to move into the rotate tool. Maybe for this one, actually, I won't use the record. I'll just like type in. I'll say, okay, you're going to rotate 30 degrees. Notice it placed the key down. So here's one way. You can just type in the numbers and it'll like add a key. You just have to remember to move to where you want the time frame. So I'll click play. And now we have a looping animation, but it's in rotation. You can see the rotation values changing. Maybe I'll do a little rotation in the Z too. All right. And so beginning and end are the same. In this case, it was zeroed out. We went in the middle and we just typed in some numbers, and notice the keyframes get dropped. I'll collect the sphere, And we're going to click record and press the E key to get the rotation tool, and we'll just add some random rotation. Unclick the record tool because we're not doing more changes, and click play. Now a sphere is like symmetrical in all axes, so you're not going to notice it rotating, but whatever. I can look in the scene view and you can see that it's rotating. Okay, how are you? So now we have two objects rotating, and I'm clicking play, and we're moving through. We have 3 keyframes: the beginning, the middle, and the end, and you can see that the numbers are changing. And I'll go to the curves view, and these curves are going to be a little bit more extreme just because the number changes are much bigger. I couldn't click play for a second, and yeah, okay, 3 numbers and all 2. Okay. And this is what they look like, just repeated out into infinity. And if you wanted to, you could jump in and move these positions for these curves, or you can even change how the curve is interpolated between points. So back to the dope sheet. I'm going to press the F key to frame up. And now we just created the rotation animation. So I'm going to create another clip. Call it my prefab 02, sorry. 02 anim 03. And now we're going to go to the cube and animate its scale. And go into the sphere and animate its scale. And we start off with a scale of 1, 100% scale. And we can do what we want here. So I'm going to move to the middle of my time. I'm going to press the R key to get a scale tool. I'm going to click record. And maybe I'll just scale them out like this. Maybe a little bit like that. All right, let me try the opposite way. I'll go long and skinny. And then the sphere will get maybe really long and skinny as well. Maybe I'll just skinny it up. And then notice I created keys now for both the cube scale and the sphere scale very quickly. Unclick record. That's super important to remember because I don't want to inadvertently make any more changes to my animation. And see how fast it can be to drop down keys. You just move to the time that you want to add a key. You can click record, or you can just start typing in the numbers and just use, if you do click record, use the gizmo tool to do your changes and just unclick record. And so here we have our scale animation. All right, so I'm going to unclick play. So now I've created 3 animations on my new prefab. So you're going to go through and you're basically creating 3 new prefabs, you know, the nesting of objects, and then going through and creating 3 animations for each new prefab. So once I'm done with the animations and I played and tested them out, tweaked them, and I'm good to go. Now I'm going to jump back to the Animator. And since I did it this way, which is creating the Animator first and then creating the animations to the animation window, a benefit is that these states were created for me. So they did some of my work for me. So notice if you read it, this is Anima1. This is the name of the state. And then here's the anim file. So if I go to project view, this is the file it's connected to. So motion really means like animation file. Here's my 3 animation files, and here's my Animator file. And so it went and said, okay, you have 3 animations, 3 states in your Animator state controller. And so as you click on them, you see that the animation files are referenced. And this is just the title. You can go ahead if you wanted to. You can rename it. Like this was supposed to be my position animation. This is my rotation animation. This is my scale animation. Just so you see it, these are titles of states, and they contain the animation file within them. All right, so notice there's an entry point and there's a line of transition. So there needs to be like a default state. We need one state to go into to start off with. So the first animation is the default state. You can change that if you wanted to, but that works for me. I'm going to click play, and notice in the animator window, so we're playing we go into the first state, and the first state is just playing that first animation on a loop. So here we're playing the position animation, and notice the blue line, beginning and just looping over and over. So cool, it works. Now, what we're going to end up doing is we want to tell the animator which animation we want it to play based on what the user chooses. So the user is going to be able to choose between 3 different animations, much like it can choose between 3 different primitives. So if you remember, this is our drop-down primitive. I'll turn it on and off. This lets you to select, do you want to generate a sphere, a cube, or a cylinder? And then it calls a public method on our script that lets us update our primitive, our prototype, so that, our property, so that when we go and create, when we go in the create loop, we know which shape we're creating. We can do something similar. Now we have a drop-down animation. It's this one here. I'll turn it on and off. And it's just a drop-down. Remember, game object UI drop-down. And it's just positioned and pinned or anchored. And the choices I gave it were position, rotation, and scale. So the user can choose which animation they want to play. And when that happens, it's going to call this animation, change animation state, which I'll get into in a little bit. But just know that we're connecting this all up through the UI into our click detector script. So, besides the states here, we have layers. Layers is like an advanced animation concept. We will not be covering that in this class, but parameters will be important for us. So parameters are like exposed properties. They're like properties that we can change. So it's like exposing values or variables out of the animator, and other code, because it's public, can call it and change it. All right. So this is, we're going to change which animations we're playing. So we can create floats, ints, bools are triggers. A trigger might be new to you. A trigger is like a simplified bool. A trigger is like saying, call this, and it like executes. It's almost like a button click. It's like bools get passed, and then it's like you check, well, what is the bool true? Okay, do the code. Right? But a trigger is even simpler. A trigger is actually very similar to a button click. A trigger just like says, call this code. So when a button click happens, you just call this method, right? You don't even care about any other data. So a trigger, it's like a simplified bool. Think of it like a button click. It's like, call it and run whatever code is connected to it, and that's it. But we want an integer. I'm going to call it state. You have to give it some type of name, and so I ended up just calling it state, and this is what I reference in my code. But now it's like a parameter on our animator called state, and it's of type integer. Now this is very similar to like materials and renderers. Like when we called the renderer, we said, okay, material set color, and it's like saying, okay, which color property do you want to set, and then what do you want to change it to? And so that's a material set color, and notice the animator is going to be very similar. So we're going to get the animator component. We're going to call set integer. There's set float, set integer, set bool, and set trigger. But we create a parameter of type integer. So we're calling set integer. And it's like, okay, what integer parameter do you want to change? What's its name? And what do you want to change it to? So it's very similar to material.setColor. Okay, so now we have a parameter of type int. Called it state, and we're going to accept values 0, 1, and 2. So much like our shape integer, which designates what we're changing, we can only say, okay, for when it's 0, we're going to create an instance of this prefab. When it's 1, it'll be this one, and 2 will be that one, which kind of coincides to sphere, cube, and cylinder. But you're making more elaborate ones now. But just know that we count from 0, so like enumerations and array elements. So 0, 1, 2 for a listed 3. So like that state will be 0, 1, and 2. Now we have our states. The next thing in our parameter that we've designated what the range of choices it'll be. Now if you go to a state and right click on it and say make transition and click on another state, this is our permissible transition. All right, so by default transitions are time based. C has exit time, and if I click play, it's going to play this, and then at the end of the time of this animation it'll transition, and now we're stuck in this state and there's nowhere else to go here, so we're just looping. So that's what has exit time means. So if I just made like transitions, like we're going to go from here to here, and here to here, and here to here, and they're all time based, it just means play this animation, at the end of its time do the transition. So now we're playing these animations one at a time, and because we have time-based transitions that are permissible from state to state, we're going to move between the states one at a time. So we don't actually want time-based transition. So I'm going to unclick that. We want condition-based. Okay, so I'm going to move down, and this is like advanced controls for how the transition should happen. We're not going to get involved in that. We're just going to leave it at the default, but I am going to add a condition. I added, and it's like, all right, what's the condition where this transition is allowed? Now notice this transition has an arrow. It's one direction. We're going from this node to that node. This is known as an edge. And this transition is allowed when our state value gets set to 1. Because this is really animation 0, this is animation 1, this is animation 2 in a list from start to end. So whenever the state value is 1 and we're in state 0, we should go to state 1. So state is equal to 1. All right. Now we can make a transition backward. When we go from state 1 to state 0, turn off has exit time, add a condition, and the state is equal to 0. To go from 1 to 0, we're moving to state 0. Now when we go from state 1 to 2, turn off has exit time, and state is equal to 2 because we're moving from state 1 to 2. And when we go from state 2 to 1, turn off has exit time, add a condition, and state should be equal to 1. We're going from 2 to 1. And this one here, we're going from 2 to 0. So state should be equal to 0. And we're missing one direction. We're going from state 0 to state 2. So that means state should be equal to 2. All right, so I set up my transitions. So I can click play. And notice we're in state 0, so we're stuck in state 0, looping and repeating. Now notice I can change it. I can test it. Let's try switch to 1. We jump to state 1 and we're staying in it. State 2, we jump to state 2 and we're staying in it. And let's test go to 0. We jump to state 0. Let's jump to 2 and 2 to 1. So cool. We're testing all the directions and we're switching all the states, and we can move between all the states correctly. So this was an entry point, a default transition. This is our kind of our default animation state, and we can now move between any state. Since we only had 3 states, it wasn't hard to make all the transitions. In this type of situation, we don't have an exit situation. You don't have to worry about that. And since there were 3 states, we could set up all the transitions, but it took time. We could also have used any state. So when you do something like this, you're saying we can go from any of these states to this state. And notice has exit time is off because you can go from any state. So usually it's like it's more often not a conditional situation. So to move from any state, which in this situation means state 0 or state 2, and to get to state 1, you would want state to be equal to 1. So, the more states you have, the more crazy you get. So sometimes you might want to use this any state node instead. But this is what it's like to manually build all the transitions. I'm just going to delete that. But if you did use this any state, you would have like 3 coming out. And you would then delete these 6 up here. But I wanted to manually show them that, so I'm just going to remove those and put this back. Awesome. So now our transitions are set up. We have an exposed parameter. We have our 3 animations that have been created. And we tested out everything. We test out the animations. We test out the transitions. Everything's in a good state. So I did forget to save my updates to the prefab. So you could say like, oh, I worked on the prefab. That's great. We're done. And I can delete the instance of it. But if I come back here and look at prefab02, you notice that there's no animator on it. If I double click and look at it, oh, the component I didn't save it out. So not all my work is lost because a lot of that work was working within the animation files in the animator. It's just I lost the component. I didn't save that out. So I can go back into my animation folder, grab my prefab02, put it back on as a component, my animator, put it on as a component, and then I can apply. So with prefabs, when you're working with it, remember this is not a prefab, this is an instance of it. This is a game object. This is sitting in memory. This is on the file disk. When you edit it, that instance of it, you have to come here and say apply it. Save the changes to the disk. Save the changes to the prefab file. Notice there's an animator there now, so I can delete this now. Awesome. So I can click play. Let me try painting. Oh wait, I probably didn't assign it. Yeah, my prefab02. Okay, it's already assigned. So cool. That's a neat animation. So I can paint, it deletes, you can right click to delete. Function's all the same, but now it animates. But this is the default animation. How do you tell it to do otherwise? Well, in the creation part of the update loop, this was messing with scale, this is messing with renderer. Here is the section on trying to figure out what to do with the animator. So we just create something, we have a reference to it, primitive. If there's a component on the top that's a type animator, we're interested in doing something. And we know that the animator will only sit at the root. I don't need to loop through the children like I do with the renderers. So if I try to get the animator component and it's not null, there's something actually there, there's a few things we can do. So notice that this is an if statement. This is false by default. I'll cover this next week. We're not going to randomize the type of animation. But what I wanted to show you is that if there's an if, we run the code that's in it. Sometimes I like to do a little shorthand of not having the brackets. So if there's just one line of code that gets executed after an if statement, notice here it's like if this. We actually are only going to run that line of code. And then we'll run this line of code no matter what. So it's like up here, it's saying like, if this is true, just do this, and then we proceed and we'll always run this line of code. But that's like also like saying I could get rid of these brackets if there's like one line. So if I could have it look something like this. If this is true and there's no brackets, we will just run the line of code underneath it, and then we continue on normal operation. So sometimes it might look like that. Technically this will run too, but sometimes I just like to put the line of code up, and on the same line, if it's all short enough, say if this is true, we will run this line of code, and no matter what, we just move on and we run that line of code. So it's like the same as saying there's a bracket here, a bracket there, and we're just running that one line of code. So that's why this looks like that. If this variable is true, we just run this line of code. And no matter what, we just move ahead and keep running the lines of code underneath. But anyway, we're not messing with the random stuff right now, so this won't happen, and that won't happen. So this will happen. All right, go get the animator, call set integer. Okay, which integer parameter do you want to change? I want to change one called state. What are you going to change it to? Animation state. Okay, so that's a property up top. Defaults to 0. It's an integer. So we're always going to play the first animation. And then this won't run because that's false. And so we're always going to set the speed to 1. Just know you can mess around with the speed as well. So if I bring this back, if I go into the animator and click on the position, here's a speed of 1. I'm just going to pop it down to 0.1. So it's like you can speed things up, you can slow things down, you can even move things in reverse. So that's the speed property here. So I can make it go really fast or really slow. And later on we'll mess with that. Or next week, I should say. But it plays at regular speed. So we're saying, hey, play the first animation and play it at regular speed. All right, but now we have a drop down here. And if I go in this drop down, and the user can say, play one of these 3 animations, 0, 1, 2. Well, what are we calling on our click detector here? Change animation state. So change animation state's public. Other objects can call it. An integer comes in. And we update our property, our animation state. I should say our field, really. It's private. So we update this animation state field. And so we use this for future content. And then this is for updating current content. So this needs to be updated, and this will be read for future content. We also go back. This is for next week when we're like randomly changing. If we are randomly changing a value, we're just keeping the UI up to date with whatever the current value is. And then this is for current content. So let me just, before I explain current content, let me just click play and paint. That's animation 1. Let it get deleted. Switch the animation, and there it's calling the animator and telling it to play the second animation. And here we're setting the state to 2, and it's playing the third animation. So we're updating future content. So that's great. Now for current content, this is very similar to like change red, green, blue, or whatever. We got to loop through all the children that are underneath click detector, because these are our currently existing prefabs. And we have to check if they have an animator at the root. And we're going to go in, get its animator, and call set integer, and we're interested in state, and update whatever the new number is. And so I'm going to unclick that so this lives forever. Here's scale, there's position, and there's rotation. So we're able to change the animation of currently existing painted strokes. And we don't have to go down another level. Like with the render, we had to go down yet another level, and I was calling it grandchildren because we're 2 steps in. But we know that the animator sits at the root. And that is it for this week. And the remainder, I got to cover next week. This prefab data is the fact that we can record an initial setting, and I got to cover the rest of the UI updates. All right, but this was the animator. And its animations. And here's what the animator looks like with its states and its transitions and its parameter. And this is what an animation looks like, with the keyframes changing properties of components, in a dope sheet with in-betweens, timeline with the scrubber, and the curve editor with the curve handles. Cool. Let me know if you have any questions.